Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we drift into the perfumed, powdered and quietly putrid world of the Sun King himself, Louis XIV of France. Picture gold leaf dripping from the ceilings, mirrors stretching 100 feet down a hallway, silk stockings, diamond buckles, and somewhere underneath all that shimmer, a smell. A real, lingering, unmistakable smell. You step into Versailles in your mind's eye, and if you had actually been there in 1700 something, you probably won't survive this without gagging at least twice.
Welcome to the Sleepy Historian channel. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video.
So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you settle in, drop your location and your local time down in the comments. I always love seeing where in the world you're drifting off from tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive in your imagination on a spring morning in the late 1600s, standing just outside the gates of the Château de Versailles. The sun is climbing, gilded rooftops catching the light like something out of a fairy tale, and already you can hear the low murmur of courtiers gathering in the distance. But before you even step through the gates, your nose registers something your eyes haven't caught up to yet. It's faint at first, carried on the breeze, something like old sweat mixed with syrupy floral perfume, mixed with something else you can't quite place. You'll place it soon enough. Louis XIV, the man they called the Sun King, ruled France for 72 years, longer than almost any monarch in recorded European history. He built Versailles from a modest hunting lodge into the most opulent palace the Western world had ever seen. He commissioned mirrors so vast and expensive that France nearly went broke, importing the glass-making secrets out of Venice, smuggling artisans across borders under threat of assassination from the jealous Venetian government. That part is very real, very documented, and honestly kind of a spy thriller hiding inside interior design history. But here's the twist you probably didn't expect walking into a story about halls of mirrors and endless splendour. The man reflected in all that glass day after day, year after year, rarely if ever took what you or I would recognise as a proper bath. You're probably sitting there thinking, surely not. Surely a king this rich, this powerful, this obsessed with appearances must have smelled like roses. And in a way he did. Just roses layered over something else entirely. That's the story we're easing into tonight. Not to mock him, not really, but to understand him and the strange contradictory world he lived in, where cleanliness and filth were tangled together in ways that would baffle a modern person standing in their shower. Let's set the scene properly. Louis was born in 1638, and he took the throne as an actual child, just 4 years old, after his father Louis XIII died. He wouldn't fully seize personal control of the government until he was in his 20s, but by the time he did, he had decided that he personally was going to be the most magnificent human being Europe had ever witnessed. Sun King wasn't just a nickname he tolerated, it was a brand he built on purpose, complete with sunburst imagery stitched into his clothing and painted onto his ceilings. He danced in ballets dressed as Apollo, the sun god himself, golden rays radiating from his headdress while the entire court applauded. And yet, underneath the golden rays and the swirling ballet costumes, was a body that historians generally agree bathed only a handful of times across his entire life. Not a handful of times a week. A handful of times, total, in 77 years of living. Now before you picture him rolling around in actual mud like some kind of medieval hog, let's be fair to the man. The court had an entire elaborate system for handling hygiene that didn't involve submerging yourself in water, and we're going to spend the next several nights unpacking exactly how that worked, why it worked that way, and what it tells us about the fears, the medicine, and the sheer strangeness of 17th century Europe. Here's your first mainstream historical fact for tonight. Something most history classes gloss over. Physicians of the era genuinely believed that water, especially hot water, opened the pores of the skin and allowed disease to creep directly into the bloodstream. Bathing wasn't seen as healthy. It was seen as a genuine medical risk, something you did sparingly, cautiously, almost like undergoing a small surgery. Lewis's own doctors would have actively discouraged him from bathing the way we do now, and in their minds, they were protecting him. Now for something a little more fringe, a little more delicious for your sleepy brain to chew on. Some accounts, though historians still argue whether these anecdotes were exaggerated by rival courts or foreign gossips trying to embarrass the French monarchy, claim that Louis was so proud of his natural unwashed scent that he considered it part of his royal aura, something almost divine, separate from ordinary men who needed to scrub themselves down like common labourers. Whether that's true or clever propaganda from jealous nobles in Spain or England, it tells you something about how differently this era thought about the human body. You'll hear a crocodile involved somewhere down the road, trust me, so tuck that away for later, a little breadcrumb for your drowsy brain to follow. For now, just sit with this image. A king, draped in the finest silks Europe could produce, dancing under crystal chandeliers, greeting ambassadors from Persia and Siam and the Ottoman Empire, all while carrying an odour that would make a modern subway car seem fresh by comparison. It's not a joke exactly, though I promise we'll find plenty to laugh softly about together tonight. It's simply the strange human truth sitting underneath centuries of gilded portraits and powdered wigs. As the evening settles around you, and your eyelids grow just a touch heavier, let's step through those enormous gilded doors of Versailles itself, because the palace, just like its king, was hiding far more beneath its polished marble than anyone dared paint into the official portraits. You step through the enormous gilded doors of Versailles, and the first thing that hits you, even before your eyes adjust to the candlelight bouncing off every mirrored surface, is the sheer scale of the place. Versailles wasn't just a home for the king. By the time Louis finished expanding it, the palace and its surrounding buildings housed somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people on any given day, a small city's worth of nobles, servants, guards, cooks and hangers-on, all crammed into corridors that were never designed to hold that many bodies at once. Here's your mainstream fact to settle into. Versailles, for all its architectural genius, was built without a comprehensive system of indoor plumbing or dedicated bathrooms in the way we understand them today. There were chamber pots, there were a limited number of what the French called leux, small closet-like rooms with a seat over a pit or a removable pan, but there were nowhere near enough of them for the population living and visiting the palace. Do the math on that for a moment. Thousands of people, one enormous building, and shockingly few actual toilets. You can imagine what happened next, and honestly, the history books don't shy away from it. Corners of hallways, the backs of staircases, even, according to several court memoirs, behind the heavy curtains draping the windows of the famous Hall of Mirrors itself, became informal relief stations for courtiers who simply could not locate a proper facility in time. Historians still argue whether this happened as constantly as the more scandalous accounts suggest, since some of the juiciest stories come from later satirical writers with their own axes to grind against the monarchy, but there's enough consistent testimony from actual visitors and residents of the era to say this wasn't a rare occurrence. It was a known, tolerated, almost expected inconvenience of palace life. Let's slow down and really sit inside this image together. You're a minor noble, invited to Versailles for the first time, dressed in your absolute finest, powdered wig sitting just so, and you've been standing in the Hall of Mirrors for 2, maybe 3 hours, watching the king pass by, hoping he notices you, hoping for some small nod of acknowledgement that might change your family's fortunes. And somewhere around hour 2, your bladder starts sending you increasingly urgent signals, but you can't leave. Leaving means missing your moment, missing the chance the king might glance your way. So what do? You shuffle a little further into the shadow of a heavy curtain, and you make do. It sounds almost like a fever dream, doesn't it? This image of glittering nobility relieving themselves behind velvet drapery while chandeliers sparkle overhead. But that's the quietly absurd truth living underneath the glamour we usually picture. Now for a quirky tidbit that tends to surprise people the most. The palace gardens, those magnificent geometric hedges and fountains that still draw millions of tourists every year, were partly designed with strong, sweet-smelling flowers, specifically because the scent helped mask the odour drifting out from the less sanitary corners of the grounds. Orange trees, jasmine and tuberose weren't just chosen for beauty. They were functional, fragrant camouflage. The gardeners of Versailles, in a very real sense, were the original odour management team, working overtime to keep the fantasy intact for visiting dignitaries. Waste removal itself became a genuine logistical headache for the palace administration. Servants were tasked with collecting the contents of chamber pots each morning, hauling them away in carts, and the smell, especially during the warmer months, apparently became so pervasive that Louis himself, on more than one occasion, ordered the palace temporarily evacuated so the entire building could be aired out and scrubbed down before court could resume. Think about that. The most powerful man in Europe, ruler of a kingdom stretching across continents through its colonies, occasionally had to pack up his entire royal court because the building smelled too bad to function in. There's something almost comforting in that, honestly. Even absolute power couldn't outdecorate basic sanitation. You might be wondering, with all this money, all this architectural ambition, why didn't they just build more bathrooms? And that's a fair question, one that touches on something we'll dig into more later tonight. Part of it comes back to that same medical fear we touched on before, the belief that water and moisture invited illness. Part of it was simply the pace of construction outstripping the pace of practical planning, since Versailles was expanded and renovated continuously across decades, with beauty and grandeur almost always prioritised over function. And part of it, frankly, was that 17th century Europe just hadn't developed the engineering concepts yet that we take for granted. Things like sealed sewage systems and consistent running water throughout a building this size. Remember that image from a moment ago, the noble tucked behind the curtain. Keep that tucked in the back of your mind because it connects directly to something we'll explore a little later tonight, when we talk about how the entire court, chamber pots included, actually travelled with the king whenever he moved between palaces. Yes, travelled. The furniture of a fully functioning, if imperfect, waste system packed onto carts and hauled across the French countryside. For now, though, let your imagination drift back to that shimmering hall of mirrors, the candlelight, the perfume, the quiet chaos hiding just behind the curtains, and let's ease gently forward into understanding why, exactly, an entire civilization decided that water itself was something to be feared. You settle deeper into this strange 17th century mindset now, because to really understand why Louis XIV and his entire court avoided bathing the way we do, you have to step into their medicine, their science, their genuine, sincere beliefs about how the human body worked. This wasn't laziness. This wasn't simply not caring about cleanliness. This was, in their minds, active, careful self-preservation. Here's your mainstream fact for tonight, and it's a big one that shapes almost everything else we'll talk about across these 15 nights together. European medicine in this era was still deeply rooted in something called humoral theory, an idea stretching all the way back to ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen. The theory held that the human body was governed by 4 fluids, or humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that health depended entirely on keeping these 4 things in delicate balance. Water, especially hot water applied directly to the skin, was believed to soften and open the pores, creating literal gateways through which disease, plague, and poisonous air, what they called miasma, could slip directly into the bloodstream and disrupt that fragile humoral balance. Sit with that for a second. To Louis's own physicians, a bath wasn't refreshing. It was a vulnerability. It was, in a very real sense, opening the front door of your house and inviting the plague inside for tea. When you think about it that way, avoiding water suddenly seems less like a bizarre choice and more like a rational response to the medical understanding available at the time. They genuinely believed they were protecting the king's life by keeping him dry. This fear wasn't limited to France either, and wasn't some isolated eccentricity of the French court. Across most of Europe throughout the 16 and 1700s, physicians shared remarkably similar anxieties about water. Queen Elizabeth I of England, famously, was once quoted, or at least the popular legend claims she was quoted, as saying she bathed once a month whether she needed it or not, which by the standards of her own era actually made her something of an outlier in the more frequent direction. Historians still argue whether that quote is genuine or a later invention meant to illustrate the era's attitudes in a punchy, memorable way, but the underlying truth it points toward, that infrequent bathing was culturally normal and even medically advised, holds up under serious scholarly scrutiny. Now, here's a quirky tidbit that tends to catch people off guard. The plague itself, the very real, very devastating outbreaks that swept across Europe repeatedly during this period, actually reinforced and deepened this fear of water, rather than teaching people the opposite lesson we might expect. Public bathhouses, which had actually been fairly common and socially acceptable in medieval Europe centuries earlier, were largely shut down and abandoned specifically because physicians began blaming them as breeding grounds for plague transmission. So in a strange twist of medical logic, a period that desperately needed better hygiene practices to combat disease ended up doing the exact opposite, retreating further away from water rather than embracing it. You can start to see now how this fear wasn't just personal preference trickling down from the top. It was baked into the entire structure of European medical thinking, reinforced by universities, taught to young doctors, prescribed by respected physicians to kings and commoners alike. Louis wasn't some outlier avoiding baths out of laziness or vanity. He was, in the eyes of his own era, being a responsible, health-conscious monarch by staying dry. That said, and this is important for us to sit with together tonight, the absence of water bathing didn't mean the absence of all hygiene practices whatsoever. This is where things get genuinely interesting, and honestly a little clever, because 17th century Europeans developed an entire alternative system for staying, in their minds, clean. Instead of washing the body directly with water, the emphasis shifted almost entirely toward what they called dry cleaning, though obviously not in the modern sense we use that phrase today. This involved vigorous rubbing of the skin with clean linen cloths, the theory being that the fabric would absorb sweat, oils, and impurities directly off the body without ever needing to open those dangerous pores with water. We're going to spend an entire section a little later tonight exploring exactly how this linen-based system worked for Louis personally, the small army of servants involved in dressing and undressing him, and just how central clean shirts became to the entire concept of royal hygiene. For now, though, just let this sink in as you drift a little further into sleepiness, an entire civilization, brilliant in so many other ways, capable of building palaces like Versailles, and advancing mathematics and astronomy and philosophy at a remarkable pace. Genuinely believed that water was one of the more dangerous substances a human body could encounter. There's something almost poetic in that contradiction, isn't there? The same era that built the Hall of Mirrors, that pursued reflection and light and beauty with such obsessive precision, quietly avoided the one substance most of us today consider absolutely essential to feeling clean and human. Historians still argue whether this fear was purely medical in origin, or whether it also tied into deeper anxieties about vanity, sin, and the body itself. Questions that stretched back even further into medieval Christian thought, about the flesh being something to be managed rather than indulged. Let that contradiction settle over you gently now, because next we're going to step directly into Louis's private chambers and watch, quietly, respectfully, as his servants perform the actual daily ritual that passed for royal cleanliness, in a world that had learned to fear the very water we now can't imagine living without. You find yourself now standing quietly at the edge of Louis's private bedchamber, early in the morning, before most of the palace has even stirred. This is one of the most fascinating windows into his daily life, something historians call the lever, which is simply the French word for rising, and it was an elaborate, almost theatrical ceremony performed every single morning of his adult reign. Here's your mainstream fact to anchor tonight's section. The lever wasn't just Louis getting out of bed. It was a formal court ritual, attended by a rotating cast of nobles who had earned the right, through rank or royal favour, to witness the king's morning routine up close. Different courtiers held the honour of handing him his shirt, his robe, even holding the royal chamber pot, and being selected for one of these small tasks was considered a genuine mark of prestige, something families would manoeuvre and scheme for years to obtain. Imagine competing fiercely politically for the privilege of handing a grown man his undershirt. That's the world you're stepping into. Now let's talk about what actually happened during this ritual, because it directly connects to everything we discussed a moment ago about the fear of water. Instead of washing his body, Louis's morning routine centred almost entirely around the changing of linen. Servants would help him remove his nightshirt, and his body would be briskly rubbed down with clean, dry cloths, sometimes lightly dampened with alcohol-based solutions or scented waters, applied only to small areas like the hands and face, never the full body. This rubbing served the dual purpose of removing surface oils and sweat, while also, in their medical understanding, stimulating healthy circulation without ever exposing him to the dangers of submerged water. His hands and face, interestingly, did receive more direct attention than the rest of his body. Basins of water, sometimes lightly warmed, sometimes scented with herbs, were used specifically for these more exposed areas, since physicians of the era generally considered face and hand washing less risky than full-body immersion. So it's not entirely accurate to say Louis never touched water at all. It's more precise to say his relationship with water was extremely selective, targeted, and cautious, applied only to the areas considered safe. Here's a quirky tidbit that tends to genuinely surprise listeners. Louis reportedly changed his linen shirt multiple times throughout a single day, sometimes as many as 3 or 4 fresh shirts, precisely because the shirt itself was doing the hygienic heavy lifting that water would normally handle. Clean linen absorbed sweat and body odour throughout the hours it was worn, and swapping it out frequently was considered the height of proper royal cleanliness. In a strange way, you could argue Louis was actually quite fastidious about hygiene, just through an entirely different mechanism than the one we'd recognise today. He wasn't dirty by the standards of his own era. He was, by 17th century French court standards, remarkably clean. This is where historians still argue about something genuinely interesting. Some scholars push back against the popular modern narrative that paints Louis as simply filthy and unwashed, arguing instead that by the hygienic standards actually practised and valued in his own time and place, he was diligent, even somewhat obsessive, about maintaining what his era considered proper cleanliness. Other historians counter that regardless of how diligently he followed the linen-changing ritual, the simple physical reality of never bathing his full body in water for years or even decades at a stretch would have resulted in an odour that modern people would find genuinely overwhelming, regardless of how many fresh shirts were involved. Both sides have a point, honestly, and the truth probably sits somewhere in the tension between them. Historical relativism bumping up against basic biological reality. Let's add one more layer to this morning ritual, something that connects back to that Versailles waste system we explored earlier. Once Louis had completed his linen-based cleaning routine, servants would assist him with dressing, a process that could take well over an hour given the sheer complexity of 17th century formal court attire. Layers of undergarments, stockings, breeches, an elaborately embroidered coat, and of course eventually his wig, each piece applied in a specific order by specific servants, performing specific roles, almost like a slow, choreographed dance around the king's body. And through all of this, remember, the room itself would have carried its own particular scent, a mixture of the herbs and alcohol used in his rub-down, the underlying human odour building beneath layers of linen, and increasingly, as the morning wore on, heavy applications of perfume meant to top off and mask whatever remained. We're going to spend real time on that perfume culture very shortly, because it deserves its own careful unpacking, but for now, just picture the layered, almost archaeological quality of Louis's daily scent, built up piece by piece each morning like sedimentary rock, herb and alcohol at the base, linen in the middle, and finally a heavy floral or musky perfume settling over the top like a final glaze. There's something almost tender in imagining this scene slowly, the quiet murmur of selected nobles watching respectfully, the careful hands of trusted servants, the ritual precision of it all, even knowing what we know now about the underlying reality it was working so hard to manage. As the linen settles into place and the final robe is draped over his shoulders, let your mind drift now toward those perfume bottles waiting on a nearby table, because that fragrant armour, sweet and heavy and just a little bit desperate, is where we're headed next. You drift now toward a small table near the window of Louis's dressing chamber, where an array of delicate glass bottles catches the early light, each one containing something precious, something imported from distant corners of the world at extraordinary expense. This is the world of 17th century perfume, and tonight we ease gently into understanding just how central fragrance became to daily royal life, not as a luxury, but almost as a necessity. Here's your mainstream fact for this section. Louis XIV was so fond of strong perfume that his court actually earned a lasting nickname because of it, sometimes referred to by contemporaries and later historians as La Cour Parfumée, the perfumed court. Musk, ambergris, civet, jasmine, orange blossom, and rose were blended in increasingly elaborate combinations, applied not just to the skin but to clothing, gloves, fans, wigs, and even furniture and drapery throughout the palace. The scent of Versailles, quite literally, was engineered, a constant heavy cloud designed to fill every room the king might pass through. Musk and civet deserve a little extra explanation here, because they tie into something genuinely strange about 17th century perfumery. Both substances came from animals, musk extracted from a gland found on musk deer, civet harvested from the scent glands of civet cats, and both carried an intensely strong, almost animalistic base note that modern noses might find borderline unpleasant in high concentration. But blended carefully with sweeter floral notes, These animal-derived musks created a rich, long-lasting fragrance that could, quite effectively, layer over and mask other less pleasant odours lingering beneath. In a way, the perfume itself was working double duty, part luxury indulgence, part functional odour management, and the two purposes were never really separated in anyone's mind at the time. Louis kept a personal perfumer on staff, a role considered genuinely prestigious within the palace hierarchy, tasked with constantly developing new scent combinations to keep the king's fragrance fresh and appropriately regal. Entire workshops within the broader Versailles complex were dedicated to producing perfumes, pomades, and scented powders, not just for the king himself, but for the wider court, since appearing at Versailles without adequate perfume would have been seen as a genuine social failing, almost as embarrassing as showing up in the wrong-coloured coat. Here's a quirky tidbit that tends to delight listeners settling in for the night. Gloves became a particularly important vehicle for perfume during this era, so much so that specialised perfumers known as gantier parfumeurs, or perfumed glove makers, developed elaborate techniques for infusing leather gloves with long-lasting fragrance. Wealthy nobles would own dozens of pairs, each scented differently for different occasions, and the leather itself would slowly release fragrance throughout the day as body heat warmed the material. It's a small detail, but it tells you just how deeply fragrance was woven into every single accessory of aristocratic life, right down to what covered your hands. Historians still argue whether this obsession with perfume developed primarily as a genuine aesthetic preference, something the court simply found beautiful and pleasurable, or whether it developed more directly as a practical necessity, born from the widespread avoidance of bathing we discussed earlier. The honest answer is probably both, tangled together in ways that are difficult to fully separate at this historical distance. Certainly the aesthetic appreciation was real and sincere. French perfumery was becoming genuinely sophisticated during this era, laying groundwork for what would eventually become the world-famous French perfume industry we still recognise today, centred in towns like Grasse in the south of France. But it seems almost impossible to fully separate that aesthetic development from the very real practical function perfume served in a society that had collectively decided water was dangerous. There's a gentle irony worth sitting with here as your eyelids grow heavier. The same avoidance of water that left bodies unwashed also, indirectly, helped birth one of France's most celebrated and enduring luxury industries. Modern French perfume houses, the ones producing bottles that sell for hundreds of dollars today, trace their lineage back through centuries of exactly this kind of court culture, this exact need to mask, to layer, to transform the human body into something more acceptable for polite powdered company. Let's slow down together for a moment and really sit inside the sensory experience of walking through Versailles during Louis's reign. Imagine layers upon layers of competing scents, hundreds of courtiers each wearing their own signature perfume blend, drifting and mixing together in the grand hallways, combined with incense burned in certain rooms for religious observances, combined with the underlying human smell we've already discussed at length, combined with whatever floral arrangements the gardeners had brought in that week. It would have been, by any modern standard, an overwhelming assault on the senses, sweet and musky and human and floral, all tangled together into something entirely unique to this particular moment in history. And yet, to the people actually living through it, this was simply normal. This was simply what a great palace smelled like. They had no other reference point, no memory of what unscented, thoroughly washed air might feel like, and so this heavy, layered atmosphere became, in its own strange way, the very scent of luxury itself, the smell of power, wealth, and royal favour, all blended together in one unforgettable cloud. As that fragrant cloud settles gently around you now, let your imagination drift back down toward the corridors and corners of the palace, because underneath all that perfume, the more practical, more chaotic reality of thousands of bodies sharing limited facilities was quietly, persistently, still unfolding. You find yourself back in the bustling corridors of Versailles now, moving among the endless stream of nobles, servants, petitioners, and hangers-on who filled this palace every single day. And tonight we're settling in to really understand the chamber pot culture that quietly defines so much of daily life here, hidden just beneath the perfume surface we spent the last section exploring. Here's your mainstream fact to ground this section. Chamber pots were an absolutely essential piece of daily furniture throughout Versailles, present in bedrooms, dressing rooms, and even, according to several court inventories that have survived to this day, tucked into certain reception rooms and hallways where courtiers might need quick access during long waits for royal audiences. These weren't crude, embarrassing objects hidden away in shame. They were often quite ornate, crafted from fine porcelain or silver, sometimes decorated with painted scenes or gilded edges, treated almost as a normal, unremarkable piece of the household's daily equipment, not so different from an elegant teacup or vase. Servants known as chaisiers, or sometimes simply palace maintenance staff, held the unglamorous but genuinely essential job of collecting and emptying these chamber pots each day, a task that required constant, exhausting labour given the sheer number of people living within the palace grounds at any given time. Estimates suggest that during the busiest periods of Louis's reign, Versailles and its surrounding buildings housed several thousand people simultaneously between the royal family, nobility, guards, servants, and various court officials. Multiply that population by daily biological necessity, and you start to understand the genuine scale of the sanitation challenge facing palace administrators every single morning. Now here's where things get a little more colourful and a little more chaotic than the ornate porcelain pots might suggest. Despite the presence of these chamber pots throughout the palace, the sheer number of people and the limited number of actual facilities meant that, as we touched on briefly before, courtiers sometimes simply couldn't wait or couldn't locate an appropriate pot in time. Several surviving letters and memoirs from courtiers and visitors to Versailles describe finding evidence of human waste in stairwells, behind tapestries, and in the corners of courtyards, a detail that seems almost impossible to reconcile with the palace's reputation for unmatched elegance and grandeur. Historians still argue about just how widespread and frequent this problem actually was. Some scholars point out that many of the more scandalous accounts come from later periods, written by critics of the monarchy during and after the French Revolution, who had strong political motivations for painting the old royal court in the most unflattering light possible. Exaggeration for political purposes was extremely common in this era, and we should approach the most extreme claims with a healthy dose of skepticism. Other historians counter that, even accounting for exaggeration, there are enough consistent independent accounts from foreign ambassadors and visiting dignitaries, people with no particular political axe to grind against the French crown, describing similar sanitation problems, that the core issue was almost certainly real, even if some of the more colourful details were embellished over time. Here's a genuinely quirky tidbit worth tucking away as you drift further into sleepiness tonight. The famous gardens of Versailles, all those perfectly manicured hedges and gravel pathways stretching out toward the horizon, occasionally served an unexpected secondary purpose for courtiers desperate enough to venture outdoors rather than navigate the crowded indoor facilities. Records suggest that palace groundskeepers had to periodically deal with similar issues, even in the carefully designed outdoor spaces, adding yet another item to the endless list of maintenance challenges facing the small army of staff required to keep this massive complex functioning day after day. Louis himself was reportedly aware of these sanitation issues and did take some steps to address them across his long reign, including periodic deep cleanings of the palace and occasional temporary relocations of the entire court, while Versailles was aired out and scrubbed down, something we touched on briefly earlier. But the fundamental architectural problem, simply not enough proper facilities for the number of people using the building, was never fully solved during his lifetime. It would take further renovations and expansions under later French monarchs, and eventually more modern plumbing innovations entirely, to properly address the core issue. There's something worth sitting with here, gently, as we ease deeper into tonight's story. This tension between extraordinary architectural ambition and basic practical shortcomings tells us something important about how humans build things, even at the absolute height of available wealth and power. Versailles was designed to overwhelm and impress. Every mirror, every fountain, every gilded ceiling calculated for maximum visual splendour. But splendour and practicality don't always align, and sometimes the most powerful people in the world end up living with the same basic frustrations as everyone else, just wrapped in significantly more expensive packaging. As you picture those ornate chamber pots sitting quietly in candlelit corners, gilded and painted and strangely elegant despite their humble function, let your mind drift now toward another very personal, very physical challenge Louis faced throughout his life, one that had nothing to do with bathing or perfume at all, but everything to do with the state of his own mouth. You lean in a little closer now, gently, as we turn toward one of the more genuinely uncomfortable chapters of Louis's physical story, his teeth. This is where the historical record gets remarkably specific, almost uncomfortably so, and tonight we ease through it slowly, the way you'd ease into any story that makes you wince just a little. Here's your mainstream fact for this section. By his early 40s, Louis had lost nearly all of his upper teeth, and the surviving accounts from his royal surgeons describe a mouth in genuinely poor condition, plagued by infections, abscesses, and the kind of chronic dental disease that 17th century medicine had almost no real tools to properly address. Dentistry as a distinct medical field barely existed yet in any organised sense. Tooth extraction was often performed by barber surgeons, the same professionals who handled bloodletting and minor surgical procedures, using tools that would look more at home in a blacksmith's shop than a modern dental office. The consequences of this dental deterioration went far beyond simple discomfort. Court physicians documented a genuinely severe complication around 1685, when a botched tooth extraction reportedly damaged part of Louis's upper jaw, creating a hole that connected his mouth directly to his nasal cavity. Imagine that for a moment, a direct opening between the inside of his mouth and his sinuses, something that would have made eating and drinking a genuinely difficult, awkward process, with liquid sometimes coming back up through his nose. Surgeons eventually cauterized the area repeatedly using hot irons in an attempt to close the opening, a procedure that by every account was excruciatingly painful and had to be endured while fully conscious, since effective anesthesia simply didn't exist yet in this era. You can only imagine what this meant for something as simple as his breath. With chronic dental infections, abscesses, and an open connection between his mouth and sinus cavity, historians generally agree that Louis's breath would have been genuinely, noticeably unpleasant, even by the more forgiving standards of an era where most people's breath wasn't exactly minty fresh to begin with. Several court accounts, written carefully and diplomatically given who they were describing, allude to this issue in the polite, indirect language typical of royal correspondence, phrases that modern historians have learned to read between the lines of. Here's a quirky tidbit that tends to genuinely surprise people settling in tonight. Despite these severe dental problems, Louis was known to be quite fond of sweet foods, particularly sugary preserves and fruit compotes, a preference shared by much of the European aristocracy of this era, since sugar was an extraordinarily expensive imported luxury, and consuming large quantities of it was, in its own strange way, a status symbol. Unfortunately, this sweet tooth almost certainly worsened his existing dental problems, creating something of a vicious cycle, sugar-rotting already vulnerable teeth, while the pain and difficulty of eating due to those same rotting teeth may have pushed him even further towards softer, sweeter foods that required less chewing. Historians still argue about just how much Louis's dental suffering influenced broader court culture and fashion during his reign. Some scholars point toward the increasing popularity of covering one's mouth while laughing or speaking during this era, along with a general cultural shift toward more restrained, closed-mouth smiles in formal portraiture, suggesting these trends may have been at least partially influenced by widespread dental problems throughout the aristocracy, not just the king himself. Other historians push back, arguing these shifts in etiquette and portraiture style had more to do with evolving standards of restrained, dignified behaviour generally, separate from any specific dental crisis. The truth, once again, probably involves some blend of both factors working together. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how much physical suffering was quietly woven into Louis's daily experience of ruling France. This was a man who danced elegantly at court balls, who sat for hours through diplomatic negotiations, who projected an image of effortless, radiant power, all while managing chronic pain from dental infections that modern medicine would resolve in a single afternoon with local anaesthesia and antibiotics we now consider completely routine. The gap between his public image and his physical reality tells you something important about the sheer discipline and performance required of royal life during this era, a kind of stoic endurance baked directly into the job description. There's a strange kind of tenderness in imagining Louis sitting quietly with his physicians, enduring painful procedures with hot cauterizing irons, all while maintaining, at least in public, the composed godlike demeanour his entire royal identity depended on. Behind the golden sunburst imagery, behind the perfumed court and the elaborate morning rituals we've already explored together, was simply a human body, aging and struggling in ways not so different from anyone else's, just with significantly worse available treatment options and significantly higher stakes for maintaining appearances. As you sit with this image of quiet royal suffering, dabbing gently at the edges of sleep now, let your mind drift forward a little further in Louis's timeline toward an even more severe and genuinely dramatic medical ordeal, one that would test his famous royal composure more than almost anything else across his entire 72-year reign. You settle in now for one of the most genuinely dramatic medical episodes of Louis's entire reign, an event that court physicians documented extensively, and one that historians frequently point to as a turning point in how the king approached both his own body and his relationship with the medical establishment surrounding him. This is the story of Louis's anal fistula, and yes, we're going to talk about it gently, respectfully, the way any good bedtime story handles the more delicate corners of history. Here's your mainstream fact to ground this section. In 1686, Louis developed a painful anal fistula, essentially an abnormal channel forming between his rectum and the surrounding skin, likely stemming from an untreated abscess that had been causing him significant discomfort for months beforehand. This wasn't some minor ailment easily dismissed. Court records indicate the pain became severe enough to interfere with his ability to sit comfortably, to ride horses, a genuinely essential skill for a 17th century monarch who needed to project physical vitality and command during military campaigns and ceremonial occasions alike. His royal surgeon, a man named Charles François Félix, was tasked with addressing the problem, and the solution ultimately settled upon was surgery. A genuinely risky proposition in an era without anaesthesia, without any real understanding of infection control as we know it today, and without antibiotics to manage the almost inevitable post-surgical complications. Felix reportedly spent months secretly practicing the procedure on other patients. Some accounts suggest including ordinary citizens who may not have fully understood the experimental nature of what they were undergoing, developing and refining a specialized surgical instrument specifically designed for this exact operation before he ever dared attempt it on the king himself. The surgery took place in November of 1686, and by every surviving account, Louis endured the entire procedure while fully conscious, restrained by attendants, gripping the arms of his chair as Felix performed the operation. Historians still argue about the precise details of exactly how the procedure was carried out, since surviving accounts vary somewhat in their specifics. But the general consensus is that it involved cutting through the fistula tract to allow proper healing, a genuinely invasive procedure by any standard, let alone one performed without modern anaesthesia or sterile technique. Remarkably, and this genuinely surprised his own physicians at the time, Louis survived the surgery and gradually recovered over the following weeks, a recovery historians attribute partly to good fortune, and partly to Felix's genuinely careful, methodical surgical technique developed through all that extensive practice beforehand. The king's survival was treated as something close to a miracle by the court, and Felix himself was showered with rewards and honours for his successful, if terrifying, surgical achievement. Here's a quirky tidbit that tends to genuinely fascinate people. In the aftermath of Louis's surgery, it reportedly became something of a strange fashion statement among certain courtiers to claim they too suffered from similar fistula problems, apparently hoping to demonstrate loyalty and solidarity with their suffering king through shared, if largely invented, medical struggles. Whether any significant number of these claims were genuine or simply courtly flattery taken to an almost absurd extreme, historians generally agree the story illustrates just how completely court life revolved around mirroring and validating whatever the king himself was experiencing, physically, emotionally, or otherwise. This surgery also had genuine ripple effects on French medicine more broadly. The specialized surgical instrument Felix developed for the procedure, along with the surgical techniques he refined through his extensive practice sessions, contributed meaningfully to the broader development of French surgical practice during this era. An early example of how royal medical crises sometimes inadvertently advance medical knowledge more broadly, since royal physicians had access to resources, time, and motivation that ordinary practitioners often lacked. Beyond the surgery itself, this entire episode offers a genuinely fascinating window into how physical vulnerability and royal image work together in this era. Louis could not simply disappear from public life to recover privately and quietly. Even in the midst of genuine, severe physical suffering, the machinery of the royal court continued running. Ambassadors still needed to be received, Decisions still needed to be made, and the king's composed, godlike public image needed to be carefully maintained even as he recovered from what was, by any honest assessment, a genuinely traumatic surgical experience. There's something worth sitting with here as your eyelids grow heavier, a reminder that behind every gilded portrait, behind every carefully staged public appearance, was simply a human body capable of suffering, capable of fear, capable of genuine physical vulnerability, no matter how much power and majesty surrounded it. Louis's Fistula surgery strips away, just for a moment, all the perfume and gold leaf we've spent so much time exploring together, and reveals something much more universally, uncomfortably human underneath. As that difficult chapter settles gently behind us now, let your imagination drift upward, away from the body and toward the head, because next we're exploring something a little lighter, a little more whimsical even. The elaborate powdered wigs that came to define Louis's image, and the surprisingly practical, surprisingly itchy reasons behind them. You drift your attention upward now, away from the more difficult medical territory we just eased through together, towards something a little more whimsical, though honestly, just as revealing about the hidden realities beneath royal splendour. Tonight we settle into the story of Louis's famous wigs, those enormous cascading curls of hair that have become almost synonymous with his image across centuries of paintings and portraits. Here's your mainstream fact for this section. Louis began wearing wigs relatively early in his reign, and historians generally agree the practice started, at least in part, as a practical response to premature hair loss, something Louis reportedly began experiencing in his 20s, a genuinely inconvenient development for a monarch whose entire public identity depended on projecting youthful, radiant vitality. Rather than simply accepting baldness, Louis embraced increasingly elaborate wigs, and because he was, well, the king, the entire French aristocracy quickly followed suit, transforming what began as a personal solution to hair loss into one of the defining fashion statements of an entire era across all of Europe. These wigs were genuinely enormous productions crafted from human hair, horsehair, or goat hair, depending on cost and availability, sometimes requiring the hair of multiple people to construct a single, suitably voluminous piece for a high-ranking noble. Wig makers, known as perruquiers, became genuinely prestigious craftsmen within French society, and the wig industry itself grew into a significant economic force, employing thousands of people across France dedicated to sourcing, treating, and styling hair for an aristocracy that had collectively decided enormous cascading curls were the absolute height of fashionable elegance. Now here's where things get genuinely uncomfortable, in a way that connects directly back to everything we've already explored together about 17th century hygiene. These elaborate wigs, sitting heavily atop heads that, remember, were rarely properly washed, created absolutely ideal conditions for lice infestations. The combination of natural body oils, limited washing, and the warm, dense environment created underneath a large wig provided lice with essentially perfect breeding conditions, and infestations were, by most historical accounts, extremely common throughout the aristocracy during this era, the king very likely included. Historians still argue about just how directly this lice problem connects to certain wig-related fashion trends of the period, but there's a compelling case to be made that heavy powdering of wigs, using scented powders made from finely ground starch, wasn't purely an aesthetic choice. Some scholars suggest the powder may have also served a practical function, helping to absorb oils and potentially making lice slightly easier to spot and remove, though this remains genuinely debated territory, without clear definitive evidence either way. Here's a quirky tidbit that tends to genuinely delight people settling in for sleep tonight. Small, specially designed combs, sometimes crafted from ivory or fine metal, with extremely narrow, closely spaced teeth, were a common accessory among the wealthy specifically for managing lice, both in their natural hair underneath wigs and in the wigs themselves. Some of these combs have survived in museum collections today, quiet, unglamorous artefacts sitting alongside the more celebrated jewellery and finery of the era, small reminders that even the most elegant aristocrats were engaged in a constant, quiet battle against parasites hiding beneath all that powder and curl. Beyond lice, these wigs also created genuine practical challenges simply due to their weight and heat. Large formal wigs could weigh several pounds, and wearing one for extended periods, through long court ceremonies, formal dinners, diplomatic receptions, would have been genuinely physically uncomfortable. causing headaches and excessive sweating underneath the dense material. Sweating that, of course, further contributed to the very odour and hygiene challenges we've spent so much time exploring together across these sections. Louis's own wigs grew increasingly elaborate as his reign progressed, eventually becoming towering, cascading creations that required significant skill and time to properly style and maintain each day. Portrait painters of the era captured this evolution carefully, and if you look across paintings of Louis from his younger years compared to his later decades, you can actually trace the growing size and complexity of his wigs as a kind of visual timeline of changing fashion trends. He himself was largely responsible for setting across the entirety of European aristocratic culture. There's something genuinely fascinating in recognising just how much of what we now consider iconic, elegant 17th century fashion was actually born from remarkably practical, even slightly uncomfortable origins. Premature baldness solved through wigs, wigs creating lice problems solved partially through powder, powder becoming its own fashion statement entirely separate from its original practical purpose. Fashion history, again and again, turns out to be full of these strange layered origin stories, practical solutions slowly transforming into pure aesthetic tradition, until eventually nobody quite remembers why the trend started in the first place. As you picture those towering powdered curls settling gently against velvet coat collars, let your mind drift now toward the women of Louis's court, because the Queen and his various mistresses navigated this same tangled world of hygiene, fashion and appearance in their own distinct, equally fascinating ways. You turn your attention now toward the women who shared Louis's world, his wife Queen Marie-Thérèse, and the long, complicated procession of mistresses who moved through his court across the decades. Women like Louise de la Vallière, Athénaïde de Montespan, and eventually Françoise d'Aubigne, who would become Madame de Maintenon and quietly his second wife later in life. Their relationship with hygiene, appearance, and the body followed many of the same broad patterns we've already explored, but with their own distinct pressures and expectations layered on top. Here's your mainstream fact for this section. Aristocratic women of this era faced arguably even greater pressure around appearance and fragrance than men did, since so much of a noblewoman's social value was explicitly tied to her physical presentation, her ability to charm, to captivate, to maintain the kind of effortless elegance the entire court culture demanded. This meant an even heavier reliance on perfume, powder, and elaborate dry cleaning rituals similar to what we explored with Louis himself, along with entirely separate categories of beauty maintenance specific to women, elaborate hairstyling, careful management of cosmetics, and the wearing of increasingly restrictive, elaborate clothing that itself created its own hygiene challenges. Madame de Montespan, who held Louis's favour for a particularly long stretch during the 1670s and into the early 1680s, was famously known for her elaborate beauty routines and her genuine skill at deploying fragrance strategically, reportedly favouring jasmine and orange blossom scents specifically chosen to complement and enhance her natural presence at court. Several accounts from contemporaries describe her as someone who understood, perhaps better than most at court, exactly how scent functioned as a tool of personal branding and influence, well before anyone would have used that particular modern language to describe it. Here's a quirky tidbit that tends to surprise listeners settling in tonight. Cosmetics of this era, particularly the heavy white face powder, favoured by many aristocratic women to achieve the fashionable pale complexion associated with nobility and leisure, often contained genuinely dangerous ingredients, including lead, which we now know causes serious health problems with prolonged exposure. Historians still argue about just how aware women of this era were regarding the potential dangers of these cosmetic ingredients, since some contemporary writings do hint at awareness of skin damage and other problems associated with heavy, prolonged use, even without full modern understanding of exactly why these effects occurred. Marie-Thérèse, Louise's actual queen, lived a somewhat quieter, less publicly celebrated life at court compared to his more famous mistresses, and by most historical accounts maintained relatively modest, restrained hygiene and beauty practices compared to some of her more flamboyant rivals for the king's attention. Several court observers noted her preference for simpler fragrances and less elaborate cosmetic routines, though she still, of course, participated fully in the broader linen-based dry cleaning rituals and perfume culture that defined the era across the entire aristocracy, regardless of individual personal preference. Madame de Maintenon, who eventually became Louis's second wife later in his reign after Marie-Thérèse's death, brought yet another distinct approach to court life, reportedly favouring simplicity and a somewhat more restrained, even austere personal style compared to the elaborate excesses of earlier decades. Some historians suggest her influence gradually helped shift broader court culture towards slightly more modest, understated fashion and presentation during the later years of Louis's reign, though this shift was gradual and never fully displaced the underlying hygiene practices we've explored throughout these sections together. It's worth pausing here to reflect on just how much labour, both physical and social, went into maintaining the elaborate appearance standards expected of aristocratic women during this era. Behind every carefully arranged curl, every perfectly applied layer of powder, every strategically chosen perfume, was hours of work performed by servants and ladies' maids, an entire invisible labour force supporting the visible elegance we tend to picture when we imagine 17th century court life. These women, servants and maids alike, rarely appear in the grand portraits we still admire today, but their careful, constant work made the entire fragrant, powdered spectacle of Versailles possible in the first place. There's a quiet kind of solidarity worth imagining here too. Servants and noblewomen alike, all navigating the same underlying reality of infrequent bathing, heavy perfume, and elaborate compensatory rituals, each doing what they could within the constraints and beliefs of their particular era, to feel presentable, feel appropriate, feel ready to step into the glittering, exhausting performance that court life demanded of everyone, regardless of rank. As you picture these women moving gracefully through perfumed hallways, curls carefully arranged, gowns rustling softly against polished floors, let your mind drift now back toward the palace itself, toward the deeper structural failures hiding beneath all this careful human effort, because Versailles' plumbing and sanitation problems deserve one more careful, gentle look before we move forward. You find yourself once more moving through the grand corridors of Versailles, but tonight we're looking a little deeper, beneath the marble floors and gilded ceilings, toward the actual physical infrastructure of the palace itself, the pipes, drains and water systems that struggled, sometimes quite visibly, to keep pace with the sheer ambition of everything built above them. Here's your mainstream fact for this section. Versailles did actually possess a genuinely impressive hydraulic system, but it was designed almost entirely for spectacle rather than sanitation. The palace's famous fountains required an enormous, sophisticated network of pipes, reservoirs, and pumping mechanisms, including the remarkable machine de Marly, an enormous water pump built along the Seine River specifically to lift water up to the elevated aqueducts feeding the Versailles fountains. This was, by any measure, one of the most impressive engineering achievements of the entire 17th century, requiring 14 enormous water wheels working together to move water uphill across a significant distance. And yet, remarkably, this same engineering brilliance was almost never directed toward practical sanitation needs, like consistent running water for washing or a proper sewage system for waste removal. The fountains needed to dazzle visiting dignitaries with their height, their timing, their sheer theatrical grandeur. Elaborate water shows were regularly staged for visiting ambassadors specifically to demonstrate French wealth and engineering prowess. Meanwhile, the actual people living inside the palace continued relying on chamber pots and limited, inadequate facilities for their daily needs, a genuinely striking contradiction between engineering priorities. Historians still argue about why exactly this imbalance persisted for so long. Some scholars suggest it reflects the broader values of the era, where visible, impressive spectacle mattered more to those in power than invisible, practical infrastructure that ordinary visitors would never see or appreciate. Fountains impressed foreign ambassadors and demonstrated royal power in a way that, say, efficient plumbing simply couldn't communicate to a 17th century audience. Other historians point toward the genuine technical difficulty of building comprehensive indoor plumbing systems at this scale during this era, arguing the engineering challenges of moving water through an enormous, constantly expanding building were simply different, and in some ways more difficult, than moving water outdoors through purpose-built fountain systems. Here's a quirky tidbit that tends to genuinely surprise people. Despite the overall sanitation shortcomings we've discussed throughout these sections, Versailles did actually contain a small number of genuinely early, relatively sophisticated flush mechanisms in certain private royal apartments, precursor systems using water reservoirs to help flush waste away from specific fixtures used exclusively by the royal family. These weren't widespread, and they certainly weren't available to the broader population living and working throughout the palace. But their existence tells us that at least some awareness of better sanitation technology existed during this era. It simply wasn't prioritised or resourced for anyone outside the most immediate royal circle. The broader waste management system for the palace relied heavily, as we discussed earlier, on manual labour, servants collecting chamber pots, carting waste away, periodically deep-cleaning sections of the palace when odours became genuinely unmanageable. This system was labour-intensive, imperfect, and frequently overwhelmed by the sheer population density of the palace during its busiest periods, particularly when the entire court gathered for major ceremonial occasions, further straining an already inadequate system. Water quality itself presented another genuine ongoing challenge. The water used throughout Versailles, whether for the small amount of washing that did occur, for drinking, or for the elaborate fountains themselves, wasn't reliably filtered or purified in any way we would recognise as safe by modern standards. Waterborne illness was a genuine, persistent risk throughout this era, not just at Versailles, but across essentially all of Europe, since the germ theory of disease wouldn't be properly developed and widely accepted until the 19th century, well over 100 years after Louis's reign had ended. This connects back, gently, to something we discussed earlier in our journey together tonight, that deep cultural fear of water as a source of disease. In a strange, almost tragic way, that fear wasn't entirely unfounded, even if the underlying medical reasoning was completely wrong. Contaminated water genuinely could and did spread illness throughout this era. They simply misunderstood the actual mechanism, blaming open pores and disrupted humours rather than the invisible microorganisms we now understand were the real culprits lurking in improperly treated water supplies. There's something worth sitting with here as your mind drifts gently forward, a reminder that even genuinely brilliant engineering achievements and the hydraulic systems powering the Versailles fountains truly were remarkable for their era, can exist alongside significant, persistent practical failures when priorities are shaped more by spectacle and image than by the quieter, less visible needs of daily human life. As the fountains continue their eternal, elegant dance somewhere out in the gardens beyond these walls, let your imagination drift now toward the inevitable consequence of all these overlapping sanitation and hygiene challenges, the disease and illness that moved quietly, persistently, through even the most glittering corners of Louis's magnificent court. You settle now into a quieter, more sombre corner of tonight's journey, because we can't fully understand Louis's Versailles without acknowledging the disease and illness that moved constantly through even its most glittering, celebrated spaces. This isn't meant to frighten you as you drift towards sleep, just to gently round out the fuller picture we've been building together across these sections. Here's your mainstream fact for this section. Despite the wealth, the perfume, and all the elaborate rituals we've explored together, disease was a persistent, unavoidable presence throughout Louis's court, striking nobility and servants alike with a kind of democratic indifference that no amount of gold or status could fully protect against. Smallpox, in particular, moved repeatedly through the French court during this era, and it claimed several members of the royal family across Louis's long reign, including, devastatingly, his son and heir, the Grand Dauphin, and later several grandchildren as well, losses that struck the aging king particularly hard in his final years. Court physicians of this era, despite genuine intelligence and dedication, worked with remarkably limited actual medical knowledge by modern standards. Bloodletting remained a common, frequently prescribed treatment for a huge range of ailments, based on that same humoral theory we discussed earlier, the idea being that removing blood could help rebalance the body's disrupted humours. Modern medicine now understands that bloodletting, especially for patients already weakened by illness, frequently did more harm than good, but it remained standard practice throughout Louis's entire reign and well beyond, deeply embedded in medical training and belief. Here's a quirky tidbit that tends to genuinely fascinate listeners settling in tonight. Louis actually played a meaningful, if lesser-known role in advancing one particular area of medical practice during his reign, related directly back to that fistula surgery we discussed earlier. Following his own successful surgical experience, Louis reportedly took a genuine personal interest in supporting and funding further surgical training and hospital development in France. A small but real example of how one man's personal medical crisis rippled outward into broader institutional support for medical advancement, even if the underlying medical knowledge of the era remained fundamentally limited by modern standards. Historians still argue about just how much the overall hygiene conditions we've explored throughout these sections, the infrequent bathing, the chamber pot challenges, the questionable water quality, actually contributed to disease transmission throughout the court, versus how much illness simply spread through other channels entirely. Respiratory transmission, contaminated food, or simple proximity in crowded spaces, regardless of bathing habits. Modern epidemiological understanding suggests hygiene certainly played some role, but wasn't necessarily the dominant factor for every type of illness circulating through the palace, since many serious diseases of this era, smallpox included, spread primarily through other mechanisms not directly related to bathing frequency. That said, poor sanitation almost certainly did contribute meaningfully to certain categories of illness, particularly gastrointestinal disease, which would have spread more readily given questionable water quality and inconsistent waste management throughout the palace. Dysentery and similar illnesses were genuinely common throughout this era across all of Europe, not just at Versailles specifically, and the general sanitation conditions we've explored together certainly wouldn't have helped matters. Louis himself, despite reaching the genuinely remarkable age of 76 by the standards of his era, a lifespan significantly longer than average life expectancy at the time, endured numerous health struggles across his long reign, beyond just the dental and fistula issues we've already explored, including gout, which became increasingly severe in his later years, causing significant pain and mobility issues that gradually limited his ability to participate in the physical activities, hunting, dancing, horseback riding, that had defined so much of his earlier public image as a vigorous, radiant sun king. There's a genuinely poignant quality to imagining Louis in his final years, still maintaining court ritual and ceremony as best he could, still receiving ambassadors, still performing the role of magnificent monarch, even as his body gradually failed him in ways that no amount of perfume, powder, or elaborate ceremony could fully disguise. The contrast between his youthful, radiant image as the Sun King and his declining physical reality in old age offers a genuinely human counterpoint to all the golden imagery we typically associate with his reign. Court physicians documented his final illness in careful, extensive detail, describing what modern medical historians generally believe was likely gangrene affecting his leg, ultimately proving fatal in September of 1715, bringing to a close a reign that had stretched across 72 remarkable, complicated years. Even in death, the elaborate rituals of French royal ceremony continued, his body prepared and displayed according to careful tradition. The same court that had spent decades perfecting the art of managing his image in life, now carefully managing the presentation of his death as well. As we sit quietly with this more sombre chapter of the story, let your mind drift gently outward now, beyond the walls of Versailles entirely, toward the reactions of foreign visitors encountering this strange, contradictory world for the very first time, because their shocked, candid observations offer us some of the most vivid, honest glimpses into what daily life at this court genuinely looked and smelled like. You imagine now a foreign ambassador, freshly arrived from some other European court, perhaps Vienna or London or Madrid, stepping through the gates of Versailles for the very first time, eyes wide with genuine astonishment at the sheer scale and beauty surrounding him. And then, just as his eyes are adjusting to all that golden splendour, his nose catches up to reality, and his carefully composed diplomatic expression falters, just slightly, just for a moment. Here's your mainstream fact for this section. Several surviving accounts from foreign visitors to Versailles during Louis's reign describe genuine shock and discomfort at the sanitary conditions they encountered, a striking contrast to the polished, idealised image the French court worked so hard to project to the outside world. These accounts come from diplomats, travellers, and various court officials representing other European nations, people who had their own, sometimes quite different standards and expectations around hygiene and sanitation, shaped by their home country's particular customs and beliefs. One of the more frequently cited categories of complaint involved the persistent odour throughout the palace, something multiple foreign visitors noted with varying degrees of diplomatic tact in their letters and journals. Some accounts describe specific unpleasant encounters, stumbling upon evidence of human waste in unexpected corners of hallways or stairwells, experiences that clearly left a genuine impression given how frequently they appear across multiple independent sources spanning different decades of Louis's long reign. Historians still argue about how much weight we should give these foreign accounts, since diplomatic relationships of this era were frequently tense, competitive, and shaped by genuine political rivalry between European powers. A visiting English or Dutch diplomat representing nations with their own complicated, sometimes adversarial relationship with France might have had genuine political motivation to emphasise embarrassing details about French court life in their reports home, whether through deliberate exaggeration or simply an unconscious tendency to notice and remember whatever confirmed their existing assumptions about French excess and hypocrisy. That said, even accounting for potential bias, the sheer consistency of these observations across visitors from genuinely different nations, different time periods within Louis's reign, and different personal circumstances lends real credibility to the underlying claims, even if specific details might have been coloured by individual perspective or political motivation. When multiple independent sources, with different backgrounds and different reasons for writing, converge on remarkably similar observations, historians generally treat that convergence as meaningful evidence, even while remaining appropriately cautious about the most extreme or colourful individual claims. Here's a quirky tidbit that tends to genuinely delight listeners settling into sleep tonight. Some visiting foreign dignitaries reportedly took to carrying their own small pomanders, hollow containers filled with fragrant herbs and spices, specifically to hold discreetly near their nose while touring certain sections of the palace. A small, practical accessory that speaks volumes about the genuine sensory challenges these visitors encountered during their stay. This wasn't considered particularly rude or unusual behaviour by the standards of the era. Pomanders were a fairly common accessory across much of aristocratic Europe generally, used in all sorts of settings where unpleasant odours might be encountered, but their specific frequent mention in connection with Versailles visits tells its own quiet, telling story. Interestingly, not every foreign account focused purely on criticism. Many visitors, even while noting genuine discomfort with certain sanitary conditions, remained genuinely, sincerely impressed by other aspects of Versailles entirely. The sheer architectural ambition, the elaborate gardens, the impressive fountains, the genuine sophistication of French court culture, fashion, art, and etiquette. This tension, genuine admiration existing alongside genuine discomfort, appears repeatedly across surviving foreign accounts, painting a picture of Versailles as something genuinely dazzling and genuinely flawed simultaneously, not a simple story of either pure grandeur or pure filth, but something more complicated and human sitting in between those two extremes. It's worth remembering, too, that many of these foreign visitors came from courts and cities with their own significant sanitation challenges. London and Vienna and Madrid were hardly pristine, perfectly hygienic environments by modern standards during this same era, so their shock at Versailles wasn't necessarily shock at encountering poor sanitation for the first time in their lives. It was more often shock at encountering it specifically within a setting that presented itself so confidently and so elaborately as the absolute pinnacle of civilized European refinement and sophistication. The contrast between image and reality, rather than the underlying reality itself, seems to be what struck so many visitors as genuinely remarkable and worth documenting carefully in their letters home. There's something almost comforting in a strange way in recognizing that this gap between polished public image and messier underlying reality isn't some unique historical anomaly limited to one particular court or one particular king. It's a remarkably persistent, remarkably human pattern, one we can still recognize echoes of in how societies present themselves outward even today. Curated appearances existing alongside messier, more complicated truths quietly humming along underneath. As those foreign observations settle gently into the back of your mind, let your imagination drift forward now toward the final years of Louis's long reign, because even this deeply entrenched world of perfume and avoidance and elaborate compensation began, slowly, quietly, to show the first small signs of genuine change. You drift now toward the final years of Louis's extraordinarily long reign, the 1700s slowly unfolding around an aging king who had by this point sat on the French throne for well over 6 decades. Tonight we ease gently into understanding the slow, subtle shifts beginning to emerge in attitudes toward hygiene during this later period. Small seeds that wouldn't fully blossom into genuine change until long after Louis himself had passed. Here's your mainstream fact for this section. Toward the very end of the 17th century and into the early years of the 18th, some medical thinkers across Europe, though still very much a minority voice within the broader medical establishment, began quietly questioning aspects of the humoral theory that had dominated European medicine for centuries. This wasn't yet a full scientific revolution that would take considerably longer to develop, but small cracks were beginning to appear in ideas that had gone essentially unchallenged for generations, including, gradually, some of the deep-seated fears surrounding water and bathing that had shaped so much of the world we've explored together tonight. Madame de Maintenon, Louise's second wife, whom we touched on briefly earlier, is often credited by historians with encouraging a somewhat more restrained, modest court culture during these final years of the reign, a shift away from some of the more flamboyant excesses of earlier decades, though this shift was subtle and gradual rather than any kind of dramatic, sweeping reform. Court fashion and etiquette during this period began showing small signs of moving towards slightly simpler presentation, though the fundamental hygiene practices we've discussed throughout these sections, the linen-based dry cleaning, the heavy reliance on perfume, remained largely intact and essentially unchanged in their core structure. Here's a quirky tidbit that tends to genuinely interest listeners settling in for these final sections tonight. Some medical writers during this later period began cautiously suggesting that certain limited forms of water application, particularly cold water, rather than the previously feared hot water, might actually offer some health benefits, rather than posing pure danger, an early tentative shift that historians can trace forward into the 18th century's gradually evolving attitudes toward bathing and hygiene more broadly. Historians still argue about exactly which specific writers or events should be credited as the true starting point of this broader shift, since ideas rarely change through one single dramatic moment, but rather through countless small cumulative shifts in thinking across many different voices and sources over an extended period of time. Louis himself, now genuinely elderly by the standards of his era, having outlived his son, several grandchildren, and countless courtiers who had populated his court throughout the decades, settled into a somewhat quieter, more subdued version of royal life during these final years. The elaborate rituals we've explored together throughout tonight's journey, the morning lever, the perfume dressing routine, continued largely unchanged, tradition and ceremony remaining remarkably resistant to change, even as the broader intellectual currents around him began, ever so slowly, shifting beneath the surface. It's worth noting that genuine widespread transformation in European hygiene practices wouldn't actually arrive until considerably later, well into the 18th and even 19th centuries, as germ theory finally developed and became widely accepted, fundamentally transforming medical understanding in ways that finally, definitively overturned the humoral theory that had shaped Louis's entire world. So while we can identify small, genuine seeds of change during these final years of his reign, we shouldn't overstate how much actually shifted during Louis's own lifetime. The France he left behind in 1715 still largely operated under the same basic hygiene assumptions that had shaped his own childhood nearly 8 decades earlier. There's something genuinely poignant in recognizing this slow, generational pace of change, especially as we sit here together, centuries later, with the benefit of hindsight and modern medical understanding that would have seemed almost magical to anyone living through Louis's era. The fears that shaped his relationship with water, the elaborate compensatory rituals of perfume and linen, all of it made genuine, careful sense within the medical framework available to him, even though we now understand that framework was fundamentally, if understandably, mistaken. As Louis's final years drew quietly toward their close, the court around him continued its elaborate perfume dance, the same rituals, the same careful ceremony, even as the wider world beyond Versailles' gates began, almost imperceptibly, shifting toward the modern understanding of hygiene and health we now take completely for granted. The Sun King, who had spent 72 years radiating light and splendor across France and beyond, was quietly approaching sunset himself, carrying with him an entire world of beliefs and rituals that would soon belong entirely to history. As we settle now toward the final chapter of tonight's journey together, let your mind drift gently across the full arc of everything we've explored. The perfume, the linen, the wigs, the fountains, the quiet human struggles hiding beneath all that golden splendor, because it's time now to reflect together on what legacy this strange, fragrant, contradictory world actually left behind. You settle now into the final chapter of tonight's long, gentle journey through the fragrant, contradictory world of Louis XIV, and as your eyes grow heavier let's ease slowly into reflecting on the legacy this remarkable, flawed era actually left behind for the centuries that followed. Here's your mainstream fact to close out our story tonight. The perfume culture that flourished so intensely throughout Louis's reign laid genuine, lasting groundwork for what would eventually become one of France's most celebrated and enduring industries. The techniques, the botanical knowledge, the sheer cultural appreciation for sophisticated fragrance that developed throughout this era carried forward across generations, eventually blossoming into the internationally renowned French perfume houses we still recognise today, centred particularly in towns like Grasse, which had already begun developing its reputation for fine fragrance production during Louis's own lifetime. In a very real sense, walking past a perfume counter today, catching that distinctive, sophisticated scent of French fragrance, you're catching a faint echo of Versailles itself, of all those courtiers and their carefully chosen signature scents drifting through gilded hallways centuries ago. Versailles itself, of course, remains one of the most visited historical sites in the entire world, drawing millions of tourists every single year who walk through those same halls, admire those same fountains, and generally have absolutely no idea about the elaborate chamber pot culture or lice-ridden wigs hiding beneath the polished, curated version of history most visitors encounter today. There's something worth sitting with in that gap, the careful curation of historical memory, the way palaces and museums naturally emphasise splendour and achievement, while quietly smoothing over the messier, more human details we've spent this entire evening carefully uncovering together. Historians still argue, and probably always will, about exactly how to properly weigh Louis's reign as a whole, an era of genuine artistic and architectural achievement, of significant political consolidation and French cultural influence spreading across Europe, existing alongside genuine, sometimes quite severe human suffering, both for Louis himself and for the countless ordinary people whose labour and taxes funded his extraordinary lifestyle. This tension between achievement and cost runs through almost every chapter of history if you look closely enough, and Louis's reign offers a particularly vivid, well-documented example of that persistent, universal human pattern. Here's a final quirky tidbit to carry gently with you into sleep tonight. Modern historians and scientists have occasionally used surviving descriptions of court hygiene practices, along with preserved artefacts like those narrow lice combs we discussed earlier, to help reconstruct a genuinely detailed, evidence-based picture of daily life at Versailles, work that continues even now, centuries later, as new documents are discovered and re-examined with fresh eyes and updated historical methods. History, it turns out, is never really finished being written. New discoveries and new perspectives continue reshaping our understanding of even well-documented figures like Louis XIV. As we close tonight's journey together, let's remember that underneath all the perfume, all the elaborate ritual, all the golden splendour we've explored across these 15 sections, was simply a human being, brilliant and flawed and genuinely suffering in ways both physical and perhaps emotional, navigating a world shaped by beliefs and fears that made sense within their own time, even when they seem strange or uncomfortable to us now, looking back with the benefit of centuries of accumulated knowledge he never had access to. Now, let your breathing slow just a little further, and let your shoulders sink gently into whatever is holding you right now. The gilded halls of Versailles are fading softly into the distance, the perfume growing fainter, the candlelight dimming to a warm, gentle glow. You don't need to remember every detail, every date, every strange and colourful fact we've wandered through together tonight. Just let the overall feeling settle over you instead. That quiet, comforting reminder that history is always more human, more complicated, and somehow more relatable than the polished portraits ever let on. Somewhere far away now, the fountains of Versailles continue their endless, elegant dance under a quiet night sky, and the Sun King himself has long since become just another gentle story, drifting softly through time, carried forward now by voices like this one, easing you so very gently towards sleep. Rest well tonight. You've earned it. Let everything else fade quietly away now, and simply drift. End of script. Sweet dreams.